What's going on, YouTube? Welcome back to another video. So, starting out, what you're gonna do is you're gonna get your image over to Procreate and you're gonna drop a new layer. Make sure you are on that new layer before you start tracing, or else you're just gonna not be able to make it to where you can use just the tracing. It's all gonna be one. So you wanna drop a new layer and start tracing. So here, I'm using my Apple pencil and I'm just tracing out an outline. You can see I made some mistakes. That's the cool thing about Procreate. You can just erase it really fast and do it again and make sure it's perfect. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna pick a color that you can see, a nice bright color. It can be any color you want, and you're gonna start tracing. The reason I do this is because if you use black, you're not really gonna be able to see exactly what you're tracing all the time. Another thing is, if you can see where I have my thickness on the Apple pencil that I'm using, I have it right at about 50%. Now I know from doing this over and over that 50% is gonna give me a nice bold line when I print out my actual stencil. Say 50% will be somewhere around, with the technical pen, somewhere around an 18 round liner. Now, I'm not always using an 18 round liner, but for the settings that I have my printer set to, this just gives me that nice bold thick line. I don't gotta worry about my stencil going anywhere. So after you have it all traced out, you got your thickness nice and thick and bold, we're gonna go over here to saturation and drop the saturation. That's gonna give us, it's gonna take our stencil from bright green to black. That way when we print, everything is solid. It comes out on your stencil paper nice and thick. If you print the light green version, it might not come out as solid. The printer might have a hard time picking that up, especially some of the smaller lines, and you're just gonna lose out on some of those details that we're trying to trace. So what I'm doing here is I'm going back. I switched over to black because I'm working on just my stencil now, and I'm cleaning up some of those lines that didn't look as good as I thought they did before. Once you take your picture away, you can see a little better. And you're just gonna go in and kind of clean up some of those lines here. After you have your stencil all cleaned up, all the lines are nice and straight, we're gonna go ahead and print the stencil. So when you're making your stencil, you wanna make sure you catch as much detail as you can. I trace everything and then I put little marks there so that I can know where the shading goes and things like that. And as you can see, I'm doing that in the lips right now. So just little touch-ups, fine-tuning, and this is gonna give you a good stencil. So when you place your stencil on your canvas, you're gonna have a nice roadmap to success. If you have a good stencil, it's gonna make the process a lot easier on you. So I make stencils a few ways. I even have another app by Pony Lawson called the Tattoo Stencil app, where you could just download a picture and hit done and it'll make the stencil for you. And this app works really well. I just find that to get the best results for a nice clean stencil, this is the best way to do it. Do it on Procreate, trace it out. It's like the old-fashioned way of just tracing, except for digitally. So you're still doing some work here. You're making sure your stencil is real good. So all right, once you have that all finished, we're gonna export, we're gonna print to our brother PJ773 AirPrint. Make sure your printer is loaded with a piece of thermal paper like mine is here. So we're gonna print out this stencil, guys. It's gonna check out these lines. We got our brother printer loaded with some Spirit thermal paper, classic, really good stuff. It's my go-to. A box lasts me about a month, so I spend the extra, what, $25 on a box of Spirit versus the off-brands, and it's worth it. All right, so here it is, printing out. Like I said, nice bold lines. If I was using an 18 round liner, it'd just be perfect. But even when I'm using a 7 or a 9, I still like to print out a nice bold stencil. It just makes it easy for me to follow. Your stencil doesn't wipe off as easy as fine lines would. Let's get a look at this real quick. All right, like I said, little bit of interference here. This was my first time my printer ran today. I probably could have ran it again and got it a little cleaner. or made sure that the paper was loaded correctly. That's one thing you want to do, but whatever. This is a very usable stencil. For the sake of the video, we're going to keep going. So before you place the stencil, I didn't want to shave my leg on video, but you shave the area. Make sure it's nice and clean. Green soap and water, shave it up. Then I take alcohol prep pads and wipe down the surface. Now, this is gonna do a few things. This is a very important step. Do not skip this step. Not only is this sterilizing the area, but this is gonna take and dry the skin a little more. So when you do place that stencil, there's not all those oils there. It's gonna help your stencil stick even better. So go ahead and get you some alcohol prep pads in a bottle, 70%, however you want to do it. 90% works too. And clean the surface off really well. Then we're going to take our stencil primer, which for this case I'm using Stencil stuff. I've been using it for a while. I've tried other brands. I've tried Electrum, I've tried Anchored, and they're all good. I've just been using Stencil stuff for so long, and I really like the way it works. I'm used to it, how I tattoo, that I just stick with the Stencil stuff. But any brand, reputable brand of stencil primer will work. I even see guys use deodorant and green soap till this day, and it works, but you're not gonna get as lasting of a hold with that type of stuff. So get you some stencil primer, clean up the skin, and then you're gonna take your stencil. This is a key part. Take a pair of scissors, and where you can, without messing up the stencil, cut a few slits in the paper. This way, when you're placing your stencil, it's not gonna fold and crack on the skin. It's gonna have some play, and it can bend with the curvature of the body where you're placing the stencil. So here we are placing the stencil stuff. So what I do is I place a nice little amount and I rub it in. We're gonna rub it in with the back of our glove here, because somehow or another I got purple stuff everywhere from my thermal paper. But anyways, we're gonna rub it in, get it all saturated, rub it in real nice. And then we're gonna wave on that with a paper towel, give it some wind. We're gonna give it some wind, and we're gonna let it kind of dry a little bit. Now, once it's tacky, I'll even let it dry a little longer than that. I'm gonna add a second layer of stencil primer, and I'm gonna dry that down. That way I know there's 2 layers. There's a nice, good, full layer of stencil primer on the skin. Now, you don't want it to be too wet when you're placing the stencil, or it's just gonna smear everywhere. So give it some wind, like I'm doing here. Put some wind on it, let it dry out just a tad, and when it starts to get a little tacky, where you can still feel it, but it's not too wet, then it's time to place the stencil. Now, another key trick that I have that I don't see a lot of people doing is I'll place my stencil down. Here I am putting the second layer of stencil primer on. So that second layer just assures that there's enough stencil stuff on the skin, and you're not gonna have, it's gonna be a solid stencil when you pull off that stencil to check it out. And there's not gonna be no patches where it didn't really stick good. Just make sure that you have enough stencil primer, because you don't wanna be redoing it again, and then your client's already wondering if you can do this or not and stuff like that. So, because that does happen, and you don't wanna be tattooing under stress. Anyways, get yourself that second layer, get the stencil. If you have to, mark it off with a Sharpie so you know where you're gonna stick it before you do any of this. But if not, when you go to stick the stencil, the key step here that I do after I place the stencil onto my skin is I'll grab a paper towel and I'll put just a little bit of green soap or distilled water on the paper towel. Just a little bit, spray it all around. So my paper towel's a little moist, not wet, but a little moist. I'll place my stencil like I'm doing here. Make sure I get it just right, good coverage and nice and flat. Then I'm gonna take that damp paper towel. Like I said, don't get it soaking wet or it's just gonna smear your stencil everywhere. I'm gonna take that damp paper towel, I'm gonna show you guys here in a second. And I'm gonna lay it over the stencil, and I'm gonna press down and apply a little bit of pressure over every side of the stencil. Now what this is gonna do is, it's just gonna help ensure that every piece of the stencil touches the skin. make sure your stencil is flat against the skin surface, the whole stencil. This way it lays down on the skin, you get full coverage, every part of your stencil has transferred over to the skin, and then you have a nice good roadmap to do a clean tattoo. So here I am pressing it down. We're gonna go ahead and take it off and let you guys see how this stencil process turned out. Here we go. You want to pull it off nice and gentle just in case you have to reuse that. Maybe you didn't place it correct. Always save the stencil until you're sure that this is what you're going to do, because you may need to try and stick that stencil again, and sometimes you can do that. Sometimes it's not always reusable, but in this case it would have been if I needed to. So here we have it, guys. Got ourselves a nice Medusa stencil, nice bold lines, solid detail. I know exactly what I'm going to tattoo, where I'm going to tattoo it, and it just makes the process a lot easier. I'm going to let this dry. This is another huge step. People say on average 10 to 15 minutes, and there's nothing wrong with that, especially if you start your tattoo from the bottom up. That way you're not wiping away at the whole stencil the whole time. But for a bigger tattoo, and when I say a bigger tattoo, let's say a football sized tattoo or not, a small football even. You know, nice big tattoos. Not too big, not too small, but whatever. If it's a nice tattoo where I might be working on it for 3 or 4 hours, I'm gonna let that stencil dry for 30 minutes. That way, we're all good and we don't have to worry about it. And that's my stencil process, guys. Peace.